So we're going to talk today about Masonic virtues after I make this full screen so I don't have to see everybody. And it's for people who are going into the East, in the entered apprentice degree, a big portion of that is a long lecture that you deliver after the end of the degree. And the last major section of this lecture discusses, the four cardinal virtues. And it's something that people always hate learning, I think partially because it's kind of the last thing you learn as you go through, and so you don't actually read it, you don't learn it as well as you would some of the other sections. So with that in mind, I kind of wanted to examine a little bit more about what these virtues are, what they meant, and how they can be applied within everyday life as Masons and just as people in general. So we're going to talk about what the Masonic virtues are. So there's four cardinal virtues that we discuss: temperance, prudence, fortitude, justice. There's also three theological virtues that are kind of mentioned in a smaller section. And the three theological virtues are faith, hope, and charity. So discussing kind of the two of those and how cardinal and theological virtues are related and how they work together will also end up being pretty interesting. How they're signified traditionally within art, where they originated. I also kind of want to discuss virtues in other cultures. I'm always interested in philosophy and comparative religions, so it's interesting to see that the same sorts of ideas are kind of a universal human characteristic. And then what these virtues themselves also mean to Masons in terms of what we take them to be, what we can do with these virtues in our everyday lives. So a virtue itself is it's a trait or quality that's deemed to be morally good, which is kind of a depends on the people giving the definition what's morally good, but it's valued as a foundation or a principle in good moral being. A similar word is arete, or something like that, which is in Greek, and in its basic sense, it means excellence of any kind. So it's something that is excellent within a person. So the term itself, the arete, may also mean moral virtue. And this notion kind of gets closer to what the virtues we're interested in are, and it's bound up with the idea of fulfillment of purpose. So yeah, you have something of what is the purpose of a horse? What is the purpose of a hammer? What is the purpose of a dog? Anything really, what its purpose, what its function is, and is it living up to its full potential? I don't think my dogs are. Horses I think sometimes do better, but in terms of a person and being virtuous, it's being able to live up to one's full potential, which is a really important thing to think of, especially as we go from cardinal virtues to theological virtues and virtues within other societies. You have this entire idea that virtues are basically living up to one's full potential in a certain way. So I've mentioned cardinal versus theological virtue, and so cardinal comes from the Latin cardo, which means hinge. So they're the basic virtues required for a virtuous life, which is a little bit of a circular definition, but it's the foundation, the building blocks of a virtuous life. If you can't have a virtuous life if you're lacking in justice, if you're intemperate, if you're not prudent. So in terms of what virtues are, what morals are necessary for a virtuous life, they've kind of been distilled down into these basic building blocks. And with these blocks, none of them are optional. They're all required within a virtuous life. And theological virtues are kind of a next step, because they have God for their object. And Masonry is a religion agnostic, well, not religion agnostic, but a religion neutral organization. So I was tempted to go through and put Supreme Architect, because it's generally whatever God of your religion that you're swearing an obligation to. But in terms of what the theological virtues are, they were discussed in primarily Christian sensibilities. So that's also why I thought it was important to include some of the other cultures as well, to show some of these similarities. But theological virtues are directed at God, and they're infused into our souls by God alone. So it's an inborn characteristic. It's a trait, and we can know them only by divine revelation. So it's not something you can't um, get better at faith. You can exercise your faith. We call it practicing your faith, but you can't become more faithful by wishing it. It's something that's instilled by God. Same with hope, that you have this hope that is instilled with you, and love. So the idea of you have cardinal virtues, which are these building blocks for a virtuous life, and then theological virtues kind of bridge that connection between everyday life and God and the higher power, and how those two connect. So the four cardinal virtues, jumping right into it. This image was taken from, I have it in the end of the slide because it took me a while to try to figure out what the source was, but it's from Albert Mackey. So it was actually generated for the cover or the front piece of one of his books, and so this was designed specifically for Masons. So we've got temperance, prudence, fortitude, and justice. So temperance is described as what an individual voluntarily refrains from doing. So it's self-restraint, it's self-discipline. It's avoiding excess, in that, if you have too much food, it's gluttony. Too little is starvation. So it's finding balance, and it's finding that middle line that is very important. So in Masonry, it teaches us to avoid excess, which could cause somebody to reveal Masonic secrets. This is an interesting part of temperance, because it sounds more like the more recent interpretation of temperance as a non-alcohol movement. So don't get too drunk, or you'll share the secrets, which, given the earlier times of Masonry, when they were meeting in pubs and bars, could also have probably been very sound advice. But it's this idea of you're tempered, you're not too hot, you're not too cold. It's kind of the right middle path to walk, and that's what makes somebody stronger. So like tempering a sword, you don't keep it in the heat too long, you don't keep it in the cold too long. You just kind of have it working on in the middle. So temperance is also usually shown with either a wheel, bridle, and reins, which is that idea of keeping kind of the passions in check. Vegetables and fish, again, kind of the food metaphor. A cup, or water and wine in two jugs. So this one seems more like the cup, but it's not a balance between water and wine. It's more of pouring into a cup. So fortitude, a lot of the times it translates as courage, but it's a bit more than courage. Courage is the choice and willingness to confront agony, pain, danger, uncertainty, or intimidation. So you can have courage or bravery in that sense, but that's still not fortitude. You've got physical courage, so something might actually hurt or cause pain or death, and then moral courage is the ability to act rightly in the face of opposition, scandal, personal loss. So that's really the right actions, as courage. So if you take this courage and you add perseverance, which is to being able to stay the course, to persevere, to um, go through the emotions, suffering, pleasure, and fear, and be able to make it through there. And with patience, you kind of wrap all of those up, and that's fortitude, which is a pretty strong definition of something, and a good virtue to emulate, because it kind of wraps in a couple other virtues as this big, like, super virtue of courage, perseverance, and patience, all wrapped into one. So for Masons, it teaches us to be in control of our emotions, especially fear. That, when confronted with danger, if someone is, trying to get in and wants to come in, that you will be able to not give them, important Masonic secrets. Although, really, if someone's going to take your life for it, um, you never know. So fortitude is also traditionally shown with armor, clubs. Sometimes there's a lion, so you have your strong lion image as well, a palm, a tower, a yoke, a broken column. So we have a little bit of a broken column on the corner here, and a little bit of armor helmet as well. So that's kind of what fortitude is showing. So prudence is the ability to govern and discipline oneself by the use of reason. It's, again, being in control of your emotions, not making rash decisions, but it comes from Latin prudentia, which means foresight or sagacity. And so it's wisdom, insight, knowledge. This is stuff that tends to happen from experience, but it's the ability to judge between virtuous and vicious actions. So um, it is important in regards to the other virtues, because it is one of the ones that you really need the most before you can really have the other virtues. If you can't tell if eating a lot of food or having a lot of drinks is going to be good or is virtuous or vicious action, if you can't determine that within reason, then you're not going to be able to succeed in temperance. So it is kind of the foundation, if you will, of what some of these virtues are. And it does teach Masons to think carefully about their words and actions, because you want to not be rash. You want to speak with wisdom, with insight, with knowledge. You don't want to just get into arguments with people on the internet just because you can. So it's really this ability to um, choose wisely. And prudence is normally shown with a book or a scroll, a mirror, sometimes attacked by a serpent. So we've got prudence with a mirror, and this looks like an arrow with what could be a snake around it. It could be a scroll. It's kind of hard to tell. But that's generally what prudence is portrayed as. So justice is, I kind of went into this with justice, the idea of like, criminal justice, like, you get your just due, but in reality, it's the moderation, the mean between selfishness and selflessness. So it's, you don't want to go out and buy all of the toilet paper just because you have to be locked in, but you also don't want to not buy toilet paper because you're worried nobody else will have some. Um, but you want to really, again, it's a middle path that you want to tread. So it's an equality between people. So a quote from Aristotle: "Its justice consists in a certain equality by which the just and definite claim of another, neither more nor less, is satisfied." So it regulates relationships with others. So you're not gonna hoard stuff if other people are in want. And so it does treat Masons, it teaches Masons to treat everyone equally. We say meet and act on the level. So that kind of reinforces that idea of being equal on the level, treating everybody with a sense of justice, kind of beyond this idea of, some of performing justice, of judging someone. With that, though, justice still does have the sword and the balance and scales and crown that traditionally goes with the Lady Justice images, but this justice is not blind, because it is about the equality of everybody. Although, justice could still be blind and treat everyone with equality. So the cardinal virtues first appeared in kind of discussion written down in the Republic by Plato. And as a philosophy major, I was interested in these sort of ethical discussions, in this idea of what's just, what a ideal society would be composed of, and discussions of that sort. So the Republic, it's a Socratic dialogue. So Plato wrote it Socrates is the main character who was Plato's mentor. And generally, it's Socrates goes around and has conversations with people. And through these conversations, ideas are discussed. So it's not unlike what we're doing here, what we do in Masonry, where we have these discussions, these presentations about certain topics. Something that I thought was interesting is this dialogue was written around 375 BC, but for Masons who use the metaphor of King Solomon's temple and the building of King Solomon's temple was destroyed in 575 BC, so 200 years before the Republic was written, when theoretically these cardinal virtues were first discussed. But the Republic itself primarily focuses on this idea of justice, what the just society, and back then in ancient Greece, it was a city-state, so it was Athens and kind of the surrounding area. And then from this idea of a just city-state, a just society, what a just man or woman would be in exploring the virtues, what it would take for these building blocks of people to be able to make a just society. And in book 4, Socrates discusses the virtues necessary for a just city. So this is for the city itself. So he said, wisdom is needed among the guardian rulers. So the rulers of the city itself need wisdom. Courage is needed among the warriors or auxiliaries. So the soldiers, you definitely want to have courage or fortitude. So temperance among all the classes to agree about who should rule and who should be ruled. So fairly democratic in that sense. And then justice in the city and state, in that each class kind of does stays within its lane, if you will. So those who are better at labor may not necessarily rule. Not that they'd be bad at it, but they're better at what it is they're doing. So this was the idea of a just city. And what's interesting with this is you get temperance and justice among everybody, but wisdom and courage are kind of these separate ideas for different groups. Instead of every aspect of the city needs all four. But compared to the individual, Socrates then goes on to describe virtues in the individual. So he says a person is wise, so they're prudent if they're ruled by the part of the soul that knows what is beneficial for each part and for the whole. So you need to know what's good for a person and for the entire group. So it's not just doing what's good for you. Courageous, having fortitude if his spirited part preserves in the midst of pleasures and pains. So, even-headed, the decisions reached by the rational part. So you're courageous, you can I think that's preserves, that might be perseveres, but you're able to not lose sight of what's important. So temperate, again, agree that the rational part should lead, this idea, which leans more towards prudence, of being able to let reason decide what should or shouldn't be the best decision. But then just is each part of the soul, again, attending to its function and not the function for another. So you can't use wisdom to be courageous. You can't use wisdom to be temperate, although you need wisdom to be temperate. But from that definition, you need the other three before you can really be just. You need all of the parts before you can be just. And with the emphasis on justice in the city-state, and for Socrates, it's the cardinal virtue, but that's kind of the apex one that, once you have all three other cardinal virtues, then you need those before you can be a just person. Another interesting tidbit I learned about the Republic, although I did read it a long time ago, but Socrates, after discussing the people that should make up this virtuous city-state, he also goes on to discuss how they should be educated. And it's what's called the quadrivium. So 4 studies that are the second part of the curriculum outlined by Plato, and it's arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. And then these built on the trivium, which were 3 sciences that were fairly well established even around those times of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So it's 7 liberal arts and sciences, which again are important to Masonry. So it's interesting that you can trace that back to some of these philosophical dialogues. So that could be a discussion for a future time of learning a little bit more about these liberal arts and sciences. So the theological virtues, like we said, in contrast to the cardinal ones, have this emphasis on God, that these virtues are given to man by God as part of their soul, as part of their being. And so in that sense, they're kind of almost of a higher order than cardinal virtues. So faith is one of them, and with other Abrahamic religions, it's a belief in the existence of God, in the reality of a transcendent domain that God administers. So the immortality of the soul, that the soul perseveres, and in the benevolence of the will of God, so God's plan. So you have faith in these 3 things, which is an interesting contrast to this emphasis on for prudence, this emphasis of reason, because faith almost does require you to not try to reason something and go through with your faith and your belief in God, in an afterlife, in the idea that God has a good plan for you, and to be able to go with that. So it could be empowering in that sense as well. Um, so it's discussed in terms of believing God's promises. So they're unproven, but you're trusting. So it's a very important trust that you have. And again, that's not really something that you can say, all right, you can say I'm going to trust somebody, but it really kind of happens internally, this ability to trust in that way. Um, and one of the common quotes about faith that I kept stumbling upon was from Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1. So now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. And that kind of leads back to this idea that faith does end when you see it, when you have transcended the human domain, the earthly domain, and you're up with God. Then your faith is proven. You don't need faith anymore because you have that evidence. But it can't be acquired by human efforts, but ask and you shall receive. It's something that happens internally, and in a kind of metaphysical way, it's something that just happens to you based on thoughts or actions or events, something like that, where faith kind of bubbles up and really helps you through things. So hope is similar to faith, but it's a combination of the desire for something and the expectation of receiving it. And it's a theological virtue because you're hoping for this divine union. You're hoping for the transcendent of the human earthly realm with God, and you get that eternal happiness. So faith itself, it says it's a function of the intellect. It's something that's going on in your brain. Hope is an act of the will. You really hope for something to happen. And it is kind of future based. It's not really something that you can't hope in the past tense. It's really something always looking forward. It's kind of an end goal of what you hope to get out of it. And again, this idea of hope ends with fruition. If you actually attain this divine union, then hope is done. You don't you've kind of made it through it. And it's interesting that this image, I might actually go back to faith as well. It's a flame, it's a lamp, so it's this burning hope that the woman is holding. And then in faith, you have somebody looking up to the sky. I'm not sure what it is that they're holding, but it's looking up. And these images were taken from a stained glass church in England as well, so that's where these came from. And then the final theological virtue is charity, which, depending on translations and verbiage, essentially means love. And it's the theological virtue where we love God above all things for his own sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. So it's that golden rule. It's the idea of you have a love of God, you have a love for people as being also part of God. So it's the ultimate perfection of the human spirit because it glorifies and reflects the nature of God. We have this idea of saying charity, that it is doing charitable works, which is a sense of it. But the reason you're doing these charitable works is because of this love that you have, this love and this ability to see people as God's creatures. So there is confusion sometimes based on translations because of the multiple meanings of the English word love. And I'll talk about him in a minute. So Thomas Aquinas thought love was a little bit too close to passion and preferred the idea of charity. But again, with faith, with hope, it's infused into the soul. And I really like this idea that it's just something that kind of like tea leaves, right? It just steeps into you, and it's something that you just kind of don't necessarily control. It's something that everybody has within them. So it's a matter of surrounding yourself in this environment where it can really flourish, where this charity, where this love can manifest itself. A Bible quote that also shows up a lot in discussing these three charities. If anybody who's ever been to a wedding will have heard, this quote about love. But the last line of it is, and now abide faith, hope, love. These three, but the greatest of these is love. So that's kind of, you have your three theological virtues: faith, hope, and love, or charity. But the greatest of these is charity. And we learn it's because faith, when you meet God, you don't need faith anymore. Same thing with hope. You don't need to hope for this divine connection. But the charity, the love that you spread, the love that you give to society, to a group, that's something that continues to flourish. So that's really important thing to remember. And so it's one of the times where the word agape, which again is another Greek word to refer to this, in this sense, it was a divine love. This was the love of God. And in English, it translates to charity in the King James Version, but a lot of other ones still just use the word love. But it is kind of the preferred one, probably because love is a bit more overarching than charity itself is. So, I mentioned Thomas Aquinas, and he was really one of the instrumental thinkers of the Catholic Church at the time. And so he wrote this big treatise, the Summa Theologica, which was written from 1265 to 1274. It was unfinished because he died, because he was working at this guy does Game of Thrones. He's working at that pace. But it was intended to be an instructional guide for theology students, so seminarians and the illiterate laity. And if you look at it, it does read a lot like some of the Socratic dialogues, where there's a statement, there's a counter statement or an argument against it, and it's this really like back and forth but concise argument and discussion, and argument in a both sides delivering statements, not yelling at each other, way of getting to a core truth. So he wrote this massive book that presented a lot of the reasoning behind Christian theology, and it follows the cycle itself, from God and creation, man and man's purpose, then Christ's sacraments, and back to a discussion about God. And in part two of it, that's when he's discussing ethics, and that human actions are subject to the rule of human reason and will. So you have your reason, which kind of controls some of the cardinal virtues, and will, which is the theological virtues. So the human virtues reside in those various powers. And so the virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, prudence, justice, temperance, and courage, he referred to those as the cardinal virtues because of the Latin term cardo that they hinge on. But he added that there was another happiness you can't simply get by following these four virtues, and that's where this he said supernatural assistance, this idea of virtues instilled or infused by God. And that's why they became theological virtues, because they had God as the object, because they were given by God and they are directed towards God. And through this revelation, kind of in a metaphysical way, is when we really receive those virtues. So it's an interesting way of thinking about kind of a difference between what cardinal virtues are, how those are the building blocks, and then how these theological virtues kind of build on the cardinal virtues, but really have a different emphasis in moving past the human realm into the realm of God, into a divine entity. So, I like comparing things to how the virtues are listed within other cultures, because, at the time, if you're dealing with Thomas Aquinas and the Summa Theologica, that's going to be very Catholic Christian based, and but you do have ancient Greek principles as well, and they are ideas that tend to transcend all ages and all cultures. So in Buddhism, there were the paramitas, the perfections. So you have generosity, morality, so proper conduct, renunciation, so that's kind of avoidance of evils, transcendental wisdom, insight, energy, diligence, vigor, that kind of deals with fortitude, patience, tolerance, forbearance, acceptance, endurance, truthfulness, determination, goodwill, serenity. So these are kind of all ideas that can be found in parallel in both the cardinal and the theological virtues. And there are of course, a lot of different branches of Buddhism out there, but they all kind of have the same idea, the same, we've got the wheel of Dharma on the right, and that's this whole life cycle of how you can break through reincarnation and then get to this perfect state, which is kind of like the end goal of being with God, or with Buddha as being enlightened. So it's still the same ideas, the same building blocks for people to be able to make those steps. So in Hinduism, again, ethics aren't something that can be imposed, but it's voluntarily lived up to, and something that you kind of come to terms on your own. And again, we have 10 virtues here: courage, forgiveness, temperance, non-covetousness, inner purity, control of senses, reflective prudence, wisdom, truthfulness, freedom from anger. Again, very important building blocks that all have parallels to these cardinal virtues and to these theological virtues, again spanning continents and ages. It's something that is kind of a universal truth. And even in Islam as well. So the foundation of Islamic understanding of virtue is the interpretation of the Quran and the practices of Muhammad. So it's been submission to God performed by the community in unison, and that the motive is that you enjoy that which is virtuous and forbid that which is vicious. So it's that middle path again. So you have major virtues: charity and philanthropy, forgiveness, tolerance, honesty, kindness and leniency, kind treatment to animals, which is interesting that one makes it in there. Buddhism and Hinduism have it in there a little bit as well. You just have to look a little deeper sometimes. Justice, fulfillment of promise, modesty, humility, decent speech, trustworthiness, patience, truthfulness, anger management, sincerity, respecting elders. So these are all, this is actually a longer list than some of the other religions. But again, this is something that these are all universal, timeless building blocks of what can make a virtuous person, and then how that virtuous person can function within a virtuous society. So again, like I try to do with a lot of presentation, is how are these ideas important to Masonry? These are something that we learn about. We either are given a long lecture about it, or if we're going to the East, we learn a lecture about it. But what is the meaning? What is the purpose of this? So in a sense, yes, the lecture is, now that you're a Mason, you need to begin extolling these virtues so you don't act in a way that's disagreeable to Masonry, which is valid, but it goes a little bit deeper than that. So within the first degree, we define Freemasonry as a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols. So we have this system of morality, and again, this is a system of morality that is independent of any specific religion. So again, with all of these different cultures, these different religions that have the same kind of building blocks, Freemasonry again utilizes the same ideas.
What, the one from my lodge?
Let's see. I thought I muted everybody.
Yeah, I'm on a blue lodge thing.
Let me.
Oh, I got you now.
There real quick. Let's see. Can everybody mute themselves, please?
Thank you, Chris.
Mute yourself, Chris, please.
Where is that going? All right. Well, I've only got a few more slides, so there we go. Mute all. All right. Not sure how that worked. So, in a similar sense, oops. Yeah, the first degree of Freemasonry is initiation. So it's the first step that you take, and it's this idea of process of change within the person. So you have some of these ideas of these virtues that are kind of just instilled into people as they receive them. So it's a way for people to kind of have this sudden change, this sudden enlightenment, and that's kind of what initiation does. And within Masonry as well, you take away some of these external distractions. You don't have minerals or metals. You're taught about charity. You're kind of outside of your comfort zone, and that kind of helps you when you're at the altar and you take an obligation. That kind of puts you in a different mindset that makes you more receptive to this change, this information. And within Masonry, the first degree focuses on this purification, this shedding these rough edges, these extra corners. And with this groundwork, the second degree focuses on illumination, on getting more knowledge, and the third degree focuses on transformation and how you go from this to kind of a final stage of knowing. So within Masonry, being able to knock out all of these other distractions and focus on purification and kind of like rebuilding, starting off with the new building blocks of these cardinal virtues. So it focuses heavily on these moral teachings to give new initiates that foundation. I also kind of thought as junior warden, we had done the entered apprentice lecture and split up the discussions about the virtues. So one of the tasks of the junior warden is to kind of help with temperance. So you can kind of see within a Masonic lodge, each one of the officers, based on their tasks or what they do, they can embody this virtue. So temperance for the junior warden, is pretty self-explanatory for those who are involved in Masonry. They watch over the lodge during times of refreshment, or when we're not in the lodge meeting. So it kind of helps remind everybody of the virtue of temperance. Fortitude, we have the junior deacon. technically it probably would be the Tyler who's outside as the guard, but the junior deacon, his job is to make sure that the door is guarded. So he's got that fortitude, that strength, and that courage and perseverance to be able to help guard the door. Prudence, we've got our lovely secretary who is very prudent, comes up with exactly what we should be doing. I see him sitting there 6 feet apart. So making these wide decisions, governing with reason within the lodge, and helping out. Justice for the senior deacon, because he can be the one to administer justice within the lodge to kind of help out if basically we need to kick anybody out. Faith, we have a chaplain, but if the chaplain's unavailable, it is the worshipful master who delivers these prayers. So with this discussion towards God, that falls onto the worshipful master, who should also be doing it as well. So the senior warden for hope, that one was a little bit of a, well, maybe the last one's a little bit harder of a stretch. We'll ask our treasurer. But the idea of harmony within the lodge, of everybody working together, and that's a hope of moving forward into the future, making sure that everybody is happy. And then charity with the treasurer, this idea of helping us to contribute to charity. This is just something random I thought of, but seemed like an interesting way to see what the 7 officers needed to open an entered apprentice lodge, if they had any sort of ways they could relate to these virtues. But in reality, if we've learned anything from this at all, it's that these officers should start embodying all of these virtues. And really, everybody within the lodge, having gone through the entered apprentice degree and having stripped away these, working on stripping away these rough edges, are going to be able to exemplify these virtues. So, some of the big takeaways that I got from doing this is that, virtues don't belong to any specific religion or culture. They're human virtues. And an author I like reading is Joseph Campbell, and he wrote this book, The Hero with 1,000 Faces, about how within all societies you have the same general myths, the same cautionary tales. All the heroes kind of follow the same path, and it moves towards almost a universal psychology of how, you've got people throughout the world, but everybody's got the same common fears and desires and uncertainty. And to deal with it, this is where some of these myths and these stories and these initiation ceremonies have come from. So, and Masonry itself focuses on universality. So everybody's got the same struggles, and we all kind of have the same general methods of dealing with these struggles. So again, by divesting candidates of material influence, you get these building blocks to be able to focus on being moral and virtuous brothers within the lodge. So here's a little bit about the images. So the frontispiece of Encyclopedia of Freemasonry, Volume 2 by Albert Mackey, and I found that from the Grand Lodge of British Columbia. Didn't say who the artist was, so it'd be interesting to track down. And then the stained glass was done by Edward Burne-Jones in a church in England. But the cardinal virtues are pretty prevalent within art, especially Renaissance art. Raphael did a painting of the 4 virtues and the 4 cardinal virtues and the 3 theological virtues, but it tended to be chopped up because he did it on a ceiling or something silly like that. So we've got time for questions. If anybody here isn't a member of the lodge or is interested in learning more, you can reach out to us at education@silverspring215.org, and then we'll be able to give that information out as well. And I'll make both. I'll print these slides out as a PDF, and then this presentation was recorded, so I'm not sure if the Facebook Live worked or not. If it does, then it'll live on Facebook as well. But then I'll put this up on YouTube as well, and this will kind of live on. So I'll scroll through and see if there's anybody has any questions, comments, anything like that, and then yeah, we can end the regular part and then just have a regular chat afterwards. All right, so I'll just go ahead and stop recording and unmute everybody.